Good evening. Ik begin even met een Nederlandse verontschuldiging voor twee zaken. Voor mijn Engels, dat niet foutloos is en zeker niet zal zijn. Misschien heb ik uw hulp af en toe nodig. En voor een tweede feit, ik ben geen expert in Amerikaanse literatuur. Ik ben gewoon een journalist. Dus ik sta hier vanavond ook als journalist. Adultery, pedophilia, if you call it that, incest, children hating their parents, you name it, it's all in Amy Bloom's books. That's not very amazing. The thing that is really amazing is she doesn't condemn these things. She doesn't show any moral indignation. And more, even the reader doesn't think about condemning all these terrible things. If you read, I'll give you an example, about the old furrier, an old man who owns a fur shop in Long Neck near New York, where most of her stories play. If this old man asks his little neighbor girl, Susan, to undress before him, and he puts a beautiful fur coat, sable or mink on her, he puts a fur hat on her head. You don't think, oh, what a terrible man, what a vieze oude man, dirty old man, an ordinary reaction. But you understand why this man does these things to little Susan. And you read, you understand how little Susan feels herself beautiful for the first time in her life. And you feel how this man loves this little girl. And another example, I understood completely why Julia, one of Amy Bloom's characters in her short stories, sleeps with her 90-year-old stepson after the death of her husband and his father. Under the circumstances, it's the right thing to do to console each other, to go on living. And you don't even think about pedagogische overwegingen, zal ik maar zeggen, van een moeder, from a mother and her stepson. I don't know how this is in real life. I've never had a son, I've only a daughter. But I can understand it's not the right thing to do. But when you read Amy's short story, you understand it all. Have you ever read, I haven't, in especially Dutch literature about children who understand the mariage à trois of their parents, who even like it, because they have two fathers instead of one. All the other girls and boys have only one father, they have two. And there isn't any guilt feeling, any consciousness of guilt. We are so used to speak about guilt and think about guilt if we have done things like Amy Bloom writes in her books. In other books, Amy Bloom's characters would feel immediately for the rest of their lives this feeling, this consciousness of guilt. What I ask myself is, has Amy Bloom in her daily life the same tolerance? Does she have this big heart that understands the frailty of men and women? I know it doesn't matter for her work, but I would like to ask her this question, and that's so nice about being a journalist. You can always ask the questions that puzzle you, so later on I'll ask her that. Amy Bloom is a psychotherapist. She is 43 years old. She lives in a little town in Connecticut, and she has a husband who is a college professor in political theory. She has 3 children, a stepson, and here's another question, and 2 younger daughters. Her first book, a collection of short stories, was released in 1993, and it was a direct hit. The stories were printed in 2 Best American Short Stories collections in 91 and 92. It got a nomination for the National Book Award in 93. Her second book, Love Invents Us, was released last month, and it is already translated in Dutch. Translation just appeared. It tells the life story of little Susan, the same little Susan who had this affair with Mr. Klein, the furrier. An awkward, loved by nobody girl who undresses for Mr. Klein. In the book, Susan is called Elizabeth. We'll ask Mrs. Bloom why she called her Elizabeth instead of Susan. She's called Elizabeth Taube, and for the non-speaking German people in the audience, Taube means duif, pigeon. Pigeon, the bird of peace, and eine Taube also means a deaf woman. It doesn't suit. This name doesn't suit Elizabeth, so I don't know why she called her Elizabeth Taube, because she is a typical Amy Bloom character, a stubborn, badly loved girl. Her parents don't love her, they have no time for her. She's not a popular girl in school, but she goes straight ahead from one dangerous venture after another. She's making victims, and she's making herself the worst of all the victims. There's her love for Mrs. Hill, an old, nearly blind, poor black woman. She helps her in life. She does all kind of nice things for her, but at the same time she steals her silver spoons, the only silver spoons she has. She has an impossible affair with a much, much older professor in her school, an affair that lasts for a long time, that makes a lot of victims, the wife of the professor, the children of the professor, and it struck me that this theme she also uses in one of her stories, a pupil of a school, a girl who has an affair that ends very unhappy with also a teacher. When I hear myself speaking, I understand that you are going to think this is a very sad and larmoyant book, but it isn't. It's very funny, and it sounds strange, but it's a very funny, understanding book, and it's the way Amy Bloom writes about her characters that make it so absorbing, and so amusing. At the end of the book, Elizabeth Taube finds her real passion, a tall, beautiful, good-looking, gorgeous, nice, kind-hearted basketball player, Huddie. But Huddie is black and Elizabeth is white, so there's not much future in this affair. But on one of the last pages of the book, Elizabeth says, "I'm happy every morning and sad only late at night." Mrs. Bloom.
I'm not sure that I can live up to all the high drama described in the stories. I'm not very good at small talk, especially before I read. It seems to me that the book is the point and not an afterword. So I thought I would read for a little bit and talk for a little bit, and then we can talk. And you can come to your own conclusions about Elizabeth and Mr. Klein because that's how the novel opens. I wasn't surprised to find myself in the back of Mr. Klein's store, wearing only my undershirt and panties, surrounded by sable. "Sable is right for you, Lisbeth," Mr. Klein said, draping a shawl-collared jacket over me. "Perfect for your skin and your eyes 1,000,000 times a day, the boys must tell you. Such skin." Well, no one except Mr. Klein had ever suggested that my appearance was pleasing. My mother took time out from filling half the houses on Long Island with large French cachepos and small porcelain dogs, and took me shopping at Lord & Taylor's Pretty Plus. Her aesthetic sense made her look the other way when the saleswomen dragged me out in navy blue dresses and plaid jumpers. Looking at me sideways, she saw the chewed ends of my hair, smudged pink harlequin glasses, and a bad attitude. I stood on a little velvet footstool, though, and modeled fur coats for Mr. Klein. He had suggested I take off my perpetual green corduroys and hooded sweatshirt so we could see how the coats really looked. I agreed, only pretending to hesitate for a minute so I could watch his thin gray face expand and pinken. I felt the warm rushing in my chest that being with him gave me, and he also gave me Belgian chocolate, because he felt Hershey's wasn't good enough for me. And he told me that if only God had blessed him and Mrs. Klein with a wonderful daughter like me, he would be truly happy, Kanahara. My mother never said I was wonderful. My father, whose admiration for my mother had diminished only a little over the years, was certainly not heard to be thanking God for giving him the gift of me. "Well, this one next, Elizabeth." Mr. Klein handed me a small mink coat and set a mink beret on my dirty hair. "Well, this is my size. Do kids wear mink coats?" If you had to dress up, this was the way to go. Much better than my scratchy navy wool, which was designed to turn chubby Jewish girls into pale Victorian wards. The fur brushed my chin, and without my glasses, because Mr. Klein and I had agreed that it was a shame to hide my lovely eyes, and so we put my glasses in his coat pocket during our modeling sessions, I felt glamorously Russian, and I couldn't see a thing. He put the beret at a slight angle and stepped back, admiring me and my bare feet and my mink. Perfect. This is how a fur coat should look on a girl. Not some little stick girl in rabbit. This is an ensemble. I turned around to see what I could of myself from the back, just a brown triangle topped by a white blur and another brown smudge. I modeled 2 more coats, a ranch mink, which displeased Mr. Klein with its careless stitching, and a fox cape, which made us both smile. Even Mr. Klein thought floor-length silver fox for me was a little much. As always, he turned his back as I pulled on my jeans and sweatshirt, and I sat down on one of the spindly pink velvet chairs, putting my sneakers on as he put away the coats. We said nothing on the drive home. I ate my chocolate, and Mr. Klein turned on WQXR, the only time I ever listened to classical music. And Mr. Klein rounded my driveway, trying to look unconcerned. I think we both expected that one Monday my parents would finally come rushing out of the house, appalled and avenging. I went inside, my shoelaces flapping against the hall's glazed, uneven brick. Could anything be less inviting than a brick hallway? It pressed into the soles of my feet, and every dropped and delicate object shattered irretrievably. I know some cleaning lady greeted me. We alternated between elderly Irish women who looked as though they'd been born to rid the world of lazy people's private filth, and middle-aged Bolivian women quietly stalking dust in our greasy, oversized fingerprints. And every dinner was a short horror. My eating habits were remarked upon, and then my mother would talk about politics and decorating and my wardrobe. And my father talked about his clients and their divorces and their bank accounts. And I would go to my room, pretend to do my homework, and read my novels. In my room, I was the Scarlet Pimpernel. Sometimes I was Sidney Carton, and once in a while I was Tarzan. I went to sleep dreaming of the 19th century, my oldest, largest teddy bear held tightly between my legs. Mr. Klein usually drove up beside me as I was walking to the bus stop. When I saw the tip of his huge, unfashionable blue Cadillac slowly slide by me and pause, I skipped ahead and dropped my books on the front seat, spared another day of riding the school bus. He dropped me off in front of the Arundel Elementary School, and as the buses discharged all the kids, I saw that I had managed to avoid them thus far. But on the mornings that he failed to appear, I kept a low profile and worried about him until the routine of school settled upon me. I was vulnerable again only at recess. The first 2 days of kindergarten had taught me to carry a book everywhere, and as soon as I found a place on the pebbled asphalt, I had only to set my eyes on the clean black letters and the soft ivory page, and I would be gone, spirited right out of what passed for my real life. Our first trip to Furs by Klein was incidental, barely a foreshadowing of our afternoons together. Mr. Klein passed me on the way home from school, and having lost 2 notebooks since school began, I'd missed the bus while searching frantically for my third, bright red canvas designed to be easily seen. I started home a couple of miles through the sticky, smoky leaf piles and across endless emerald lawns. No one knew I liked to walk. Mr. Klein pulled up ahead of me and signaled shyly, and I ran to the car, gratified to tears by a smile I could see from the road. "I'll give you a ride home, but I need to stop back at my shop, something I forgot, all right?" I nodded. It was better than all right. Maybe I'd never have to go home. He could drive me right to Mexico, night after night through the Great Plains, and I wouldn't mind. Furs by Klein stood on the corner of Shore Drive, its curved, pink-tinted windows and black lacquered French doors the height of suburban elegance. And inside stood headless bodies, 6 rose velvet torsos, each wearing a fur coat. There were mirrors everywhere I looked and a few thin-legged, armless chairs. The walls were lined with coats and jackets and capes, and above them, floating on transparent necks, were the hats. Mr. Klein watched me. "Go ahead," he said. "All ladies like hats." He pulled down a few and walked discreetly into the workroom at the rear. I tried on a black cloche with a dotted veil, and then a Kelly green fedora with a band of arching brown feathers, and Mr. Klein emerged from the back, his hands in the pockets of his baggy gray trousers. "Come, your mother will be worried about you. Leave the hats, it's all right. Mondays are the day off. The girls will put them back tomorrow." And he turned out the lights and opened the door for me. "My mother's not home," I said. "I'm really an orphan. Adopt me." "I'm so absent-minded," he said. "Mrs. Klein tells me your mother is a famous decorator. Of course she is out, decorating." He smiled just slightly, and I laughed, and I thought he's on my side. Almost every morning now he gave me a ride to school. Without any negotiating that I remember, I knew that on Monday afternoons I would miss my bus, and he would pick me up as I walked down Arundel Avenue. I would keep him company while he did whatever he did in the back room, and I tried on hats. And after a few Mondays, I eyed the coats. "Of course," he said, "when you're grown up, you'll tell your husband, 'Get me a sable from Klein's. It's Klein's or nothing.'" He waggled a finger sternly, showing me who I would be, a pretty young woman with a rich, indulgent husband. "Let me help you." Mr. Klein slipped an ash blonde mink jacket over my sweatshirt and admired me aloud. Soon after, he stopped going into the workroom, and soon after that, I began taking off my clothes. The pleasure on Mr. Klein's face made me forget everything I heard in the low tones of my parents' conversation and everything I saw in my own mirror, and I chose to believe Mr. Klein. At home, to conjure up the feeling of Mr. Klein's cool, round fingertips on my shoulders, touching me lightly before the satin lining descended, I listened to classical music, and my father made approving snorts behind the newspaper. I lay on the floor of the living room behind the biggest couch and saw myself playing the piano, adult and beautifully formed. I am wearing a dress I saw on Marilyn Monroe, the sheerest clinging net with sparkling stones coming up over the tips of my breasts and down between my legs, and I am moving slowly across the stage, the wide hem of my sable cape shaping a series of round, dark waves. I hand the cape to an adoring Mr. Klein, who was slightly improved and handsomely turned out in a tuxedo cut just like my father's. My mother stepped over me and then stopped. I was eye to toe with her tiny pink suede loafers and happy to stay that way. Her round blue eyes and her fear of wrinkles had made her stare as harsh and haunting as the eyeless Greek heads she kept putting in my father's study. "Are you keeping busy, Elizabeth?" I couldn't imagine what had prompted this. My mother usually acted as though I had been raised by a responsible, affectionate governess, and guilt and love were as foreign to her as butter and sugar. "Yeah, you know, school and books." I studied the little gold bar across the tongue of her right loafer. "And all is well?" "It's fine, everything's fine." "You wouldn't like to study an instrument, would you? Piano? Perhaps a piano in the library? That could be very attractive. You know, an older piece, deep browns, a maroon paisley shawl over the top, silver picture frames? Very attractive." "Well, I don't know. Can I think about it?" I didn't mind being part of my mother's endless redecorating. In the past, her domestic fantasies had produced my queen-sized brass bed, which I loved, and a giant Tudor dollhouse complete with chiming doorbell and working shower. "Well, of course, you think it over. Let's make a decision next week, shall we?" And she started to touch my hair and patted me on the shoulder instead. I didn't see Mr. Klein until the following Monday. I endured 4 mornings at the bus stop, leaves stuffed down my shirt, books knocked into the trash can, lunch bag tossed from boy to boy. Fortunately, the bus driver was crazy, and his rageful mutterings and yelping at invisible assailants captured whatever attention might have come my way once we were on the bus. It was raining that Monday, and I wondered if I could walk anyway. I never thought about the fact that Mr. Klein and I had no way to contact each other. I could only wait in silence. I pulled up my hood and started walking down Arundel, waiting for a blue streak to come past my left side, waiting for the slight skid of wet leaves as Mr. Klein braked to a stop. And finally, much closer to home than usual, the car came. "You're almost home," he said. "Maybe I should just take you home? We can go to the store another time." He looked rushed and unhappy. "Well, sure, if you don't have time, that's all right." "I have time, Tatskala, I have time." He turned the car around and drove us back to Furs by Klein. I got out and waited in the rain while he unlocked the big black doors. "You're soaking wet," he said harshly. "You should have taken the bus." "I missed it," I lied. If he wasn't going to admit that he wanted me to miss the bus, I wasn't going to admit that I had missed it for him. "Well, yes, you missed the bus. I pick you up. Lisbeth, you are a very special girl, and standing around an old man's shop in wet clothes is not what you should be doing." Well, what I usually did was stand around in no clothes at all, but I could tell that Mr. Klein, like most adults, was now working only from his version of the script. I sat down uneasily at the little table with the swiveling gilt-frame mirror ready to try on hats. Without Mr. Klein's encouragement, I wouldn't even look at the coats. And he didn't hand me any hats. He pressed his thin, sharp face deep into the side of my neck, pushing my sweatshirt aside with one hand. And I looked in the mirror and saw my own round, wet face, comic in its surprise and pink glasses. And I saw Mr. Klein's curly gray hair in a bald spot I would never have discovered otherwise. "Get your coat." He rubbed his face with both hands and stood by the door. "I don't have a coat." "They let you go in the rain with no coat?" "Let's go, please." He held the door open for me, and I had to walk through it. The chocolate wasn't my usual Belgian slab. It was a deep gold foil box tied with pink and gold wisps and topped with a cluster of sparkling gold berries, and he dropped it in my lap like something diseased. I held on to the box, stroking the fairy ribbons until he told me to open it. Each of the 6 chocolates had a figure on top, 3 milk, 3 bittersweet, each one carved with angel wings or a heart or a white-rimmed rose. And in our fat-free home, my eating habits were regarded as criminal, and my parents would no more have bought me beautiful chocolates than gift-wrapped a gun for a killer. "Lisbeth?" He looked out the window at the rain, and I looked up at him quickly. I had obviously done something wrong, and although my parents' anger and chagrin didn't bother me a bit, his unhappiness was pulling me apart. I crushed one of the chocolates with my fingers, and Mr. Klein saw me. "No. No," he said softly, wiping my fingers with his handkerchief, and he cleared his throat. "My schedule is changing. I won't be able to give you rides after school. I'm going to open the shop on Mondays." "How about in the morning?" I didn't know I could talk through this kind of pain. "I don't think so. I need to get in a little earlier. It's not so bad. You should ride with other boys and girls. You'll see you'll have a good time." I sat there sullenly, ostentatiously mashing each of the chocolates. "Oh, it's too bad. They're very nice chocolates," he said. "Teutschers, remember, Sable from Klein's, chocolate from Teutschers, only the best for you." "I'm telling you, Lisbeth, only the best." "I'm not going to have a good time on the bus." I didn't mash the last chocolate. I just ran a fingertip over the tiny ridges of the rosebud. "Well, maybe not. I shouldn't have said you'd have a good time. I'm sorry." He sighed and looked away. I bit into the last chocolate. "Here, you have some too." "No, they're for you. They're all for you," he said. "I'm not that hungry." "Here," I held out the chocolate half, and he lowered his head, startling me. I put my fingers up to his narrow lips, and he took the chocolate neatly between his teeth, and I could feel the very edge of his teeth against my fingers. We pulled up in front of my house, and he put his hand over mine for just one moment. "I'll say it again. Only the best is good enough for you. So we'll say au revoir, Lisbeth, not goodbye." "Au revoir. Thank you very much for the chocolates." My mother's instructions surfaced at odd times. I left my dripping sneakers on the brick floor and dropped my wet clothes into my lilac straw hamper and took my very first voluntary shower. I dried off slowly, watching myself in the steamy mirror, and when I didn't come down for dinner, my mother found me naked and quiet, deep in my covers. "Let's get the piano," I said. I started lessons with Mr. Kennedy the next week, and he served me wine-flavored cookies instead of chocolate, and one day he bent forward to push my sleeves back over my aching wrists, and I saw my beautiful self take shape in his eyes, and I loved him too. Okay. Let's see. This is Elizabeth about 5 years later. She is taking care of her dear friend, Mrs. Hill. Mrs. Hill has severely impaired vision. "Let's have a look-see at that right hand," Mrs. Hill said, eyes on the ceiling. Vivian said absolutely no more pork rinds. I was 15 now, and in our 2 years we had 1 ambulance ride, 2 angina attacks, and more than a few sponge baths between us, and after Pride and Prejudice, we alternated between the tabloids and the poetry of Mr. Paul Dunbar. "Do you see Vivian on the premises?" "Oh, come on, Mrs. Hill, it's not good for you." There's no other adult I could talk to like that. My mother never did anything that wasn't good for her. My father's arteries were of no interest to me. And Mr. Stone, who knew something about everything, had made it clear that we could talk about me, but not about him. "Who dropped you off? I heard a car door." Mrs. Hill liked to think that her hearing was so extra sharp to make up for her eyesight. "Mr. Stone? Who's that?" "He's my English teacher this year." "Why's he dropping you off here?" Mrs. Hill was always faintly accusatory, and I shrugged, which I knew she couldn't see but would feel, and I started peeling the carrots. "Elizabeth, am I talking to myself? Are you in some kind of trouble at school?" "No, I'm not. I imagine he dropped me off here because I was going here." And I spoke very slowly and clearly to show her how stupid she was being. "How old a man is this Mr. Who?" "Mr. Stone? I don't know, he's old. Do you want these carrots pureed or in circles to go with peas or something?" "He drives you home a lot?" I sliced the carrots into inedible, oversized chunks and went into her bedroom to gather up the laundry. She would have to sit and wait for me to come back. Her legs hurt too much for her to follow me around, pestering me. "I don't think your mother has met him." "Your legs are getting long." I shrugged again. "You stopped wearing your glasses. How come?" "Contacts." I loved my contacts. I loved the sharp world, and I loved my eyes, edged in black eyeliner, and I had scratched my corneas twice because I couldn't bear to take the lenses out except for sleep. Mr. Stone dropped me off on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and after that I tried to shut the car door softly, grabbing it with both hands to keep it from slamming, and as soon as I walked out through the door, Mrs. Hill would say, "Fool," as though she were speaking to someone else. Mr. Stone still picked me up after school most days, and I was pretty sure I'd stopped growing. I pressed my knees one way and my feet the other just to sit almost comfortably in the VW's front seat, and I rode with my hands tucked between my legs. I put on lip gloss in his visor mirror. Comic book remnants and paper cups and cigarette packs covered my sneakers. One Tuesday afternoon, at the second light, I said what I've been wanting to say since February vacation. "I think it'd be nice if you met Mrs. Hill. I think she'd like to meet you. She used to teach, I think." "Really?" he said. "She said she did. Don't forget, it's this one on the left." And Mr. Stone said out the window, "You know, I grew up in a place a lot like this, mostly white, though. My God, look at those." He pointed to twin blue-shuttered houses with orderly twin gardens and bitty porches, each with 2 chairs and a small plastic table set with 4 tall pink glasses and matching pictures. "You smell that?" "That's the smell of the South right there. Mint, dirt, and cornstarch." And I led him in, describing our progress to Mrs. Hill so she wouldn't be surprised and pissy. "We're here, Mrs. Hill. I brought Mr. Stone, my English teacher. He thought he'd just stop by and say hi." But Mr. Stone didn't look like he appreciated being shanghaied into the middle of Mrs. Hill's blue brocade living room set, and Mrs. Hill looked right at him, which was like turning her back. "Well, welcome, Mr. Stone, Elizabeth's famous English teacher. Honey, why don't you make us some tea?" And I just stood there until Mrs. Hill flapped her hands a couple of times like I was a loose chicken, and then I backed out, watching Mr. Stone. He smiled at Mrs. Hill and flapped a hand, too, and I listened on the other side of the kitchen door, which was so thin I could hear her sighing and Mr. Stone sighing back. "Could you come a little closer? My eyesight's not so very good." It was Mrs. Hill's sweet little old lady voice. I heard him drag the ottoman over, which meant he was sitting a good 6 inches below her, putting them face to face, or ear to face, since Mrs. Hill was probably trying to get him right in her sights. "You're not even a young-looking man," she said, and I heard Mr. Stone laugh. "No, ma'am." He sounded different, Southern, not his classroom voice, not his smoking in the car voice. "Come a little closer," Mrs. Hill said. "South Carolina?" "Yes, ma'am, Kershaw." "And you?" "Mars, Alabama." The tip of his nose had to be denting her puddingy cheek for them to be talking so quietly. "All the way from Kershaw. My." For a minute I didn't hear anything. "And what do you want with my girl? You like girls in particular? Children?" Mr. Stone breathed in fast. I wanted to rush in and hit her, and as she lay on the floor, we would drive off to someplace pastel and foreign in our dark red convertible. "No, ma'am, I'm not like that. I don't prefer girls to women. I have a wife at home and 3 boys. "Well, then," she said, and I thought so there and wondered how close they were now. I could just see a sliver of his shoe tips pointed toward her recliner. "Well, then," he echoed, "I know it doesn't seem right. I could lie to you. That's what a reasonable man would do. A reasonable man. Jesus. Well, I beg your pardon, ma'am." And I heard Mrs. Hill's wheezing and Mr. Stone's deep cough and the clock on the mantel. "I don't do anything I shouldn't," he said, "except what you're thinking, and you won't stop that, will you?" "Well, can't, not won't," he said. "How can I? I'm not leaving town, if that's what you mean. That's what it would take, about 3,000 miles. We could throw in an ocean." Very softly, Mrs. Hill said, "We could throw in 2 oceans for all the good it'll do you, and you know we should, because there is no glory coming from this. This is not a conversation about forgiveness. I don't care how you end. That's your concern or your poor wife's. But you put one hand on that child who thinks you love her fine mind. One hand even when she's more grown, and I'll see you turn in hell. Don't think I won't know. That child tells me everything, so maybe you can keep your hands to yourself, and I won't have to think so badly of you, Mr. Stone." "Yes, ma'am, I don't want you to think badly of me. I don't want to think badly of myself. I have no intention of harming her. You must see that whatever it looks like, it is love, and I have to say it is in part for her fine mind. I give you my word. Well, I don't have much else under the circumstances. I would cut off my hand first." It didn't sound to me like it was so hard for him to give me up and just admire my mind for the rest of his life. He didn't sound so madly in love with me that it was scaring him and Mrs. Hill. He just sounded happy to be talking Southern. The 2 of them purring along, word endings gone to nothing, their voices loopier and wider and sweeter than when they talked to me. I brought in the teacups, went back for the spoons, and had to go back a 3rd time for milk. Mr. Stone poured. Mrs. Hill told a couple of funny stories about the kids in her Sunday school class, all of them at least Mr. Stone's age now. And Mr. Stone slapped his leg and laughed. And I walked him to the door, and he said my name and straightened my shirt collar. And I lifted my shoulders to meet his fingers, and he dropped the little bit of shirt he'd been holding. Mrs. Hill said, of course he should come by again. He said, of course he would hope to come by again. Without imposing on her hospitality, it would be a pleasure. And I closed the door behind him. She was already sighing and sucking her teeth, getting warmed up for something. "Oh, that's you, Mr. Stone." "Uh-huh. Do you want some dinner? There's turkey tetrazzini. You have that 3-bean salad from the weekend." "It's all right, Elizabeth, in a minute. You going to make me shout all night?" "No, ma'am," I said, sighing at least as loudly as she had. The ottoman was still warm, even damp, from when Mr. Stone sat on it and told her he loved me. "He sure does like you, and you like him. He's all right. He's a good teacher. He likes poetry. 'Who is she that looketh forth in the morning? Fair as the moon, clear as the sun, and terrible as an army with banners.' Like that," Mrs. Hill said. I didn't answer. I just walked into the kitchen while she was reciting. "You're in the room. You're out of the room. I know what I know. Elizabeth, were you eavesdropping?" "I don't care what you know, and I don't care what you said, and I'm starting your dinner. Could I trouble you for a glass of water?" I gave her the water and cooked and washed up while she ate, which took forever. And I wiped up the bean salad goop and the turkey shreds and wiped down the counters. "I'm going." "You be good. Be careful. You're going to thank me someday. Those plates?" I slammed the door. I got a job at the Great Neck Public Library, and I boxed old magazines and stole old books, and Mr. Stone didn't call me. And in the fall, I was in high school. I wanted to bump into Danny or Benji Stone and remind them of what a great babysitter I was, but I never saw them, although I looked in the comic book store near the parks. I drank vodka and Hawaiian punch with Eddie Sachs and his brother in their basement, and I think that's all I did the first year of high school. Mr. Stone wrote to me in June, inviting me to make tapes of a Treasure Island for his junior high literacy project, and I threw out the letter. "I'm going to be really busy next year," I said when he called. "Oh, please, I can't do it without you," he said. "I don't know, I'm going to be really busy," I said. "Elizabeth," he said, "don't make me beg." Okay, one more short piece. This is Elizabeth and Huddie, the great love of each other's lives. They meet as teenagers. They are separated for 7 years. He has seen her again for the first time. She is taking care of the ill Mr. Stone, and Huddie is running the local fruit and vegetable store. Huddie's wires cross every which way now. Sight, smell, taste, and touch enfold one another. Wet is like sweet, is like heat, is the aching pulse, is salt caking. Her smell is the smell of the unwrapped, ready-to-rot figs, and for a lost half hour he scrunches thin lilac tissue paper around their small purple asses, tilting their stems so each seamed bottom is turned to its most seductive side. Carrot fronds are her hair. The slick celadon crack of a broken honeydew is hers and tastes cool and then warm. He puts his lips flat against tomatoes, plums, peaches, and nectarines before stacking them, and they ripen too fast, with hard-to-sell dark spots where his saliva has gathered and seeped in. Marshmallows of no interest since early Boy Scouts seem to roll right out of their bags, pull his fingers into their sweet, dusty white middles, pull themselves up around his fingertips. Half a bag. That's 23 marshmallows. His fingers are stiff, powdered white, and his throat is glued shut, but the sugar thickly coating his lips and the drying tug from the roof of his mouth to the root of his tongue is so like a past moment between them. He has to sit down behind the unshelved goods, head resting on the giant cans of juice, sticky hands hard over sticky mouth, and cry without making a sound. They finally meet in a motel room. Huddie lifted his head and pulled the sheet up to his shoulders, unbearably tired, filled with thoughts of his wife and his son and everything he would lose and everything he had lost just in this hour. And she slid her fingers down his neck, flicking sweat off his chest. Who had left such wide, milky pools on the bed? All right, he said, patting the hand on his shoulder, keeping his face turned away to not see her tears and to not have her see his. When he rose to leave, after 3 false starts, there was no afternoon light left, just the chill blue-gray of winter dusk and the white Hollywood-style bathroom lights buzzing through it. You're leaving, Elizabeth said. Leaving you? One of her hairs would not come loose from his tongue. Her earrings had left twin intimate gouges on his cheeks, and these awkward things gave him as much pleasure as all the official great moments of his life put together. No. It only looks that way. I am right here. He put his hand between her breasts and felt his palms sink by 1/4 inches, lodging far beneath the surface of her skin. Right here. Okay. I don't have a tremendous amount to say about the patterns in American fiction today. I read everything that I can get my hands on by almost everybody. Sometimes for fun and sometimes for work. I read about 250 books last summer because I was a judge for the National Book Awards, which gave me a better idea, I guess, in some ways than I would like of the patterns of American fiction. Big is one of the patterns of American fiction, is what I discovered. But it seems to me, I guess what I find myself thinking about is not so much American fiction, but the kinds of books I like and the kinds of things I like to write about. Somebody asked me when I was in interviews today if I was ever going to write about anything except love. And I think the answer is probably not. The only things that interest me are people, actually. And I do think that love invents us. And I do think that literature shows us who we are. And it seems to me, that the world around us, the world that we get born into, sort of colors the vessel that we are. Class and culture and color decorates the vessel. But the vessel itself is made, with our temperament and who we are born to, and the love that they have for us, or the lack of love, or the complicated love. And it is love that alters and distorts and molds the vessel that we are throughout the rest of our lives, it seems to me. And that's really all I wanted to write about, because it is true that I write a lot about wrong and unlikely people to love, but it's also the case that almost everybody seems to me in the right light to be a wrong and unlikely person to love. And the longer you are with somebody, the more moments I think you have in which it occurs to you that no matter how well suited you may be, you are at times living with a stranger. The things that I found myself most interested in were the relationships between mothers and fathers and each other and their children, and how children change their parents as well as parents change their children, and marriage and its relationship, which I think is sometimes close and sometimes distant to love, and passion and the way in which it is at the center of some love and not others, and the way in which we struggle to have it coexist with security and habit, and that there is a crisis that love presents to us over and over the course of each relationship and over the course of a lifetime. And we keep struggling, I think, with our wish to be known and our wish to be private and separate and our wish to merge with somebody else and the terror that that evokes in us and how deep into another person we wish to see and how much we would rather not see who somebody else is and what shape we would like our lives to have. And, I think that those are the things that strike me as most important. There's a Henry James quote in which he says, and I think it is true of writers in particular and people in general, we work in the dark and we give what we have and we do what we can. And I think it's clear from what I've written so far and probably from what I'll go on writing for the next 40 years that that is really that and how we see each other and ourselves and how that keeps changing are the only things that are really very interesting to me. So I'll end there.
I do hope people get better when you work with them.
I think it's pretty clear that everybody who is going to get better soon already got better soon. I mean, I've been doing this for 19 years. Once in a while I take on couples cases. I take a few couples cases, but that's it. I mean, I've already made some choice because I can't do the kind of work I used to do. I used to see people 3 times a week for a couple of years, sort of more intensively, and I can't do that. And write because I need more time to wander around the house
and think.
Yeah, think big thoughts, right.
But if you have to choose, what would you choose?
So which child would you like me to throw out the window? No, I can't imagine not having a small practice, and I can't imagine writing, and I guess if I lived in some bizarre world in which I had to only do one, I guess I could always write and keep it in a box and see people for a long time and then flip it around. Yeah. I wouldn't choose, that's the answer. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it.
Yeah. I have a question here from the audience, and it is a question I like to pose to you too. Literature shows us how we are, you said. Being a psychotherapist, how would you define the difference between psychology and literature?
So when I saw the Queen, I don't ever think of them actually as having a whole lot in common. I think that there's a way in which an understanding of people, if that's what we're calling psychology, informs good writing. I think, or certainly good writing about people. I don't think psychotherapy or a clinical understanding of people does much at all for literature. And I think, when, if I saw it creeping into my work, I would do my best to weed it out as being something that doesn't belong in there. When you write, you don't want people thinking, oh, isn't she clever? You want people to be in the middle of the book, in the middle of the lives, not thinking about, what the hobbies of the author are. So.
But I think you need the same things. You have to listen to people, you have to observe people, you have to go into the lives of your patients, and you have to go into the lives of your characters. I think that there's much in common.
I think that the listening and the observing is good training for the writing. I absolutely think that's true. But I think most good therapists become therapists because they are interested in people. Mm-hmm. Being a therapist doesn't make you, as any of you know who have ever been to a bad therapist, being a therapist doesn't make you interested in people.
No.
So I was a waitress for a long time too, and I was interested in people then, and in their stories, and in how they act and what they do. So for me, getting to spend a lot of time listening to people's stories has certainly been reinforced my sense that what goes on inside of people's lives is different than what it looks like on the surface. But I have to say I was inclined to think that before anyway.
Yes. I know you can't use your clients' stories in your work. Isn't it tempting from time to time to use it?
This guy asked me that. I said, it's like, for me, it's as if I said to you, is it tempting to steal from the blind? No, it's not tempting to do a terrible thing to people who trust you. It's when people are telling me their stories in therapy, first of all, I'm working. I'm not sitting there going, what an interesting expression. I'm working.
Yeah.
So that's what they pay you for, And it never feels that way to me. These are their stories. And the truth is, I meet enough weird people outside my office that, that I don't ever find it necessary to, to cannibalize my clients. You think about all the people there's plenty of stories.
Do you think it scares them?
My clients?
You being a writer?
I am such a dinosaur as a therapist. I am so old-fashioned, and I'm so conservative. And no, I did have one guy actually say to me, who I've been seeing. He said, I was a little disappointed. He said, I didn't see anything about me in any of the stories. But that was about it.
But why did you study psychology?
Well, I was a mediocre actress, is the truth.
You were a waitress?
I was a great waitress.
Oh.
Well, I was an excellent waitress. I was a mediocre actress, and that was my first job after college. I was with a theater company, and I thought I didn't actually want to make my whole career being a mediocre person on stage. And so what I really liked doing, even with the theater company, was coaching people for their auditions and listening to people's stories and seeing what was going on. And before I went to college, I had done some counseling work of different kinds. So I thought I would go on doing what I was good at, which was listening to people's stories.
And it pakte out, it's what you wanted it to be. It worked.
Yeah? I'm kind of snoopy, and I'm a little bossy, and I'm extremely curious.
Yeah, that's what you need. But that's also what you need to have to be a writer or a journalist. Why didn't you choose journalism? Your father was a journalist.
Yeah. I wasn't that interested in the facts, I guess.
Oh, no. But if you can't have your inspiration from your clients, you say, and your patients, where do you find your inspiration? So many weird people aren't around in Durham, Connecticut, I think.
Oh,
or are there?
Small town life is, sort of a fountain of peculiarity, actually. I've got friends, I've got relatives.
And a stepson.
Yeah, it's, there are plenty of folks out there. And then you get everybody that you see in the airports and the coffee shops and the grocery store and the people you get to make things up about, or, the guy who, when I was down the street today, was sort of obsessively ordering cheese slice by slice that I had never seen before. I mean, he was ordering half a pound of cheese. But it wasn't just like, give me a half pound slice.
No,
It
but
was like,
that's
I
typical
want that
Dutch.
slice, and
Yes.
then that slice. And I'm watching to see the difference between the slices, you know? And that slice. No, not that slice. So, you know, it took 25 minutes. So I don't feel like I ever lack for material.
When do you write? Because you have a busy life with 2 daughters, your work, your garden. You told me you like gardening. When do you work?
At night. It doesn't actually
No,
matter
I
what
mean
else
work
do.
when you write.
I know what you
call.
I know what you
I
mean.
call writing working. The other thing is not work.
No. No, I write late at night because I think it takes me a while to get going. I'm not very disciplined about writing fiction. The other kind of writing I can do during the day, but fiction.
What's the other kind of writing?
Oh, I do magazine and newspaper pieces sometimes. Not factual newspaper pieces, you know, stuff I make up.
But about what?
Oh, well, I got this very peculiar assignment from the New York Times to write about the foremost botanical watercolorist in America. I don't know why they called me. Actually, what the lady said is, I read this short story of yours in the New Yorker, which, believe me, had no flowers and no watercolors in it. And I thought you'd be great for this story.
And what do you know about botanical watercolors?
Nothing. And I said, sure. You know, I mean, I can read, you know. So I read about it, and I went and looked at pictures, and I interviewed this lady who was great, who was very crusty and very English and very peculiar. And so I write about stuff like that. I mean, I write about stuff when people ask me.
But why on earth do you write these columns when you can write so beautiful books, such beautiful books?
Yeah, because
isn't it a pity?
It's a shame. Yeah,
you're
because
you're wasting your time.
Well, I've heard that, but the truth is, it's easy, and fiction
That's
is
right,
hard,
yeah.
and fiction makes me nervous. So if I could, I mean, I'm very glad actually that I have this productive way of avoiding writing fiction, because I used to just, you know, like do laundry.
Yeah.
And now I
that's
have
better.
and now I have this really good thing that I can do when I'm not writing fiction, which is to write nonfiction.
So writing, I mean, fiction is late at night, 11 o'clock.
Right.
And
So
then
sort of right before I lapse into unconsciousness is the best time. Yeah.
you say writing fiction makes you nervous.
It does. Even talking about writing fiction makes me a little nervous.
I can understand that. You're suffering. Writing is suffering, I think.
Apparently, yeah.
You hate it.
It sounds worse and worse. It's hard, you know, and I'm fussy, and I'm slow. I mean, it's a terrible combination. I'm very particular. I do a lot of rewriting, and I'm very, very slow.
Are there good writers who are fast writers?
I hope not.
No, I can't imagine.
Oh, I'm sure there are, and I'm sure that, in fact, we like to think that they are bad writers, but they're probably very good writers, and they're just fast.
Yeah.
And they need less sleep than I do.
How nervous are you
When
when
I'm
you
writing?
start writing fiction? Yeah.
Oh, it's.
Do you want to vomit?
No, I have a pretty
that's
strong
already
constitution.
something.
Yes, no, so that's good. I don't. That's a plus. I don't want to vomit. No, I just pace. You know, I pace. I eat crackers. I make tea. I check the mail, even though I know the mail isn't there. You know, I call my sister and talk about
Put
shoes.
the laundry in the machine.
Sometimes it has to get pretty bad now for me to put the laundry in the machines. You know, I water the plants, feed the cat, feed the plants,
at
water
12
the
o'clock
cat.
at night,
Yeah.
1 o'clock at Oh, it's awful.
It's a full day, but
Yeah.
you know, I don't get a lot done. This
Yeah.
person has his hand up. This gentleman had his hand up.
Did the reading of books make any difference to your day?
I'm sorry, one more time?
You told us about reading all the books this past summer.
Uh-huh.
Oh, 250 books, yeah.
Make any difference to your schedule of the day?
Well, I had less time for wandering around than I usually do. It was great. It was very interesting for me. You know, and sometimes I don't know if other people in the audience are writers, but sometimes it's great to read other really good writers, and sometimes it's a little anxiety-producing to read other really good writers, especially when they're finished with their books. But I had already finished my book, so it was okay. And then, of course, it's quite reassuring to read all these other really bad writers who are also getting published. It was very interesting. It was, I'm a fast reader, and there were some books that after about 200 pages, I felt that I could put them down and that I wasn't doing them a disservice. And most of the books I finished. And they just sort of swam in my head, yeah. Well, also, some of them were very short, and some of them were mistakes. I mean, they're not such a efficient organization, so they sent us some children's books, which I read immediately. They sent us a couple of nonfiction books. They also slipped in one cookbook by mistake, which I actually thought was sort of like a surreal book. I thought, oh, this is sort of like one of those sort of very interesting postmodern kinds of books. And I just thought I was dumb. I just didn't understand, and then I realized it was a true cookbook, and I could put it down.
Yeah.
Who are some of your favorite or people who have influenced you, contemporary American fiction writers?
I'm trying to get the category right. So, favorite American contemporary fiction writers. A book that stayed with me for a very long time, which almost makes it into this category, but not quite, was called Duke of Deception by Jeffrey Wolfe, Tobias Wolfe's big brother, which I thought was an amazing book. It's just a chronicle of his life with his father, who is, paternally speaking, a disaster. And it's a fascinating and, I think, tremendously honest and very funny and very disturbing book. And that has always sort of stayed with me. And I don't know who people read here. There's a woman named Tilly Olson who wrote only one collection of short stories. And I have to say, if you had to go through life and only produce one small collection of short stories, it would be okay if it was Tilly Olson's, which was, I think, also an extraordinary book. Alice Adams' short stories I liked very much, which I read a number of years ago, and I remember being struck by the way in which she used parenthetical remarks, which when I first read her short stories was a very new thing. I had sort of been reading very kind of straight ahead traditional American literature, sort of classic American literature, or sort of more minimalist stuff, and Ray Carver. And I'm trying to think. I also liked Louisa May Alcott when I was growing up, which is not exactly contemporary, but I actually do still read Little Women from time to time. I guess I also like John Updike a lot, although not because I think he has a particularly good grasp of women, which in fact I think he has sort of a dim grasp of women. But it doesn't seem to affect his ability to write about marriage and to write marital dialogue in a way that I think is wonderful. And it's, to me, an amazing act that there could be this huge blind spot that I often perceive in his work, and that he manages to go right past it in the way he writes about couples. So,
is marital dialogue something else, something special?
Yeah, I think there's a particular way, whatever the marriage is. I mean, I think we see marital dialogues between people who have been business partners for 40 years, as well as people who have been best friends. Or there's a particular way in which people who know each other very well and whose fates are sort of bound to each other in a certain way communicate, I think. And I think he does that very well. So that's a long enough list. I mean, I could go on for a long time. I read a lot.
You have the same taste? You are, yeah?
I was really wondering if you were going to mention Lynn Sharon Schwartz. You know who that is?
I do know her work, and I do like her work. But that's what I would probably have to say. I know her work, and I like it. I don't. I've only read some of it in the last couple of years. Oh, actually, there is somebody else. I think, in terms of a certain kind of purity of work, I don't know that she's read so much over here. Her name is Rebecca Brown, and she wrote a book called Gifts of the Body, which just knocked me out. It's a novel in the form of a sort of an account of a home health aide who's taking care of AIDS patients, and it's absolutely clear prose. It just, you look right through it into the lives of the people. So
Makes you jealous.
no, it makes me glad. Partially because she's a friend, and I think compared to her, my style is positively lush, and fluffy.
Yeah.
So it's a different kind of work,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
it's really beautiful work, I think.
I have another question from the audience. It seems like you turned one short story from your first book into a novel. You think that other short stories will also become novels?
Well, they might. It's probably going to be a little while before I know what the next novel is going to be like, given my rate of production. This short story actually didn't. It looks in the book as though what happened is I took this short story and expanded it into a novel, but that's not actually how it worked. The novel that I started writing really began somewhat later. There's this scene soon after that opening story with Elizabeth and her friend Mrs. Hill, the spoons
Yeah.
scene that we talked about. And that's really where the novel started for me. And when I finished that story, that scene, I realized it was the same little girl. And then I was sort of stuck because I didn't want to leave out the story with Mr. Klein. I wasn't really sure that I was allowed to use the short story again, but it seemed to me that it was an important part of Elizabeth's story. And then the way the structure of the novel worked out, that ended up going at the beginning. So it looks much more of a considered evolution and expansion than it really was.
And why did you call her Elizabeth instead of Susan?
Because I didn't think I could go through life with this character named Susie for the period of the novel. That's it. It's really true. I just thought Susie was kind of a dumb name, and I couldn't stand to be. It's not. I mean, it's not that I don't like the name Susan, which I do, but it didn't sound right to me
Yeah.
for this girl, and I spent a lot of time thinking about it and playing around with different names. You know how when you're a schoolgirl, like you write the names of your crushes on your notebook? I was writing name after name after name and trying to come up with the right girl's name, but I knew Susan wasn't it, so we had to scrap that.
And Taube?
That's true. I had a boyfriend whose last name was Taube. It's true that she is not a dove, and it's true that she is only intermittently deaf, although there's certainly plenty that she doesn't hear. It just, I like the bounce of the name.
Yes.
And that's it.
Ja, gaat u gang.
Miss Moon, your novel has three parts. The first and the last part are written in first person. In the second part, the middle part, you're speaking of Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
What did you choose?
I had played around actually with that part a lot because for me the novel is not, Elizabeth is one of the main characters, and I realize she's the only one who gets to speak in the first person, but I did not want this to be just her story. I really wanted the other characters, especially Max and Huddie, to have their own voice, and there was too much that she could not see and that we had to be able to see from inside of them. I wanted to see her from how they saw her, and I also wanted to be able to sort of be inside of their lives more than I could with the first person. But I also didn't want to lose her voice entirely. And then, originally I stopped the novel when Elizabeth was in her 20s, and then I'm sure this is a bias of being in my 40s, but I decided that that it would be more interesting, obviously to me, if she were in her 40s, because I think of people in their 40s as having more to lose. And so as I continued with the novel, I realized I could go back to her voice and let us see who she has become through that process. So it was like that.
I think dramatically it's very important. Did you see it the moment you read it, or was it afterwards that you thought, oh, it's the third person?
Well, that's the way I think I'm reading.
Yeah?
That's the way they teach you knowledge. You don't observe what the writer is trying to let you see, but you take in mind he's a sort of constructor.
Yeah.
Yes, and I miss that. I think you'll have a lot of trouble in writing this novel. I think I knew the stories and I liked it very
Mm-hmm.
but the first time I read a novel, it disappointed me a bit. I found it too full of, well, let me take, the way you see that man Max, the teacher of 40 who falls in love with a girl of 18, the way you see his physical disqualities.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a word, disqualities?
I know what you mean.
Disqualities. I was a bit tired of that.
Mhm.
I think it's because I'm 70 plus. But can you, oh no, you have not to explain that, but it's just the way I was reading.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm very thankful for the way you give Elizabeth a voice tonight, because if I was here to her, I don't try to tell you that you're Elizabeth,
Mm-hmm.
but you voiced her, I think, very, very good.
Oh, good.
Thank you.
Good. You're welcome. I'm glad.
Kan ik nog iemand het woord geven? Ja.
Of those 250 books you have read, were there any books about black Americans or Native Americans?
Yes, I would say not. Not in the 30s or 40s. There were, I think, I have to tell you, I didn't do an ethnic breakdown, but my memory is that there were about 7 books by authors who describe themselves as Native Americans, and about 15 books by authors who describe themselves as African Americans.
No more?
Now, can I respond to the part
Yes.
about Max and his disintegration?
Yeah.
There were a couple
knew
of
you were going
reasons.
to do it.
There were 2 things that struck me about it. One is that actually he's about 46 and she is about 15, which I think is actually a little different than 40 and 18. But part of what struck me is that I think when there's this enormous discrepancy in power and a significant discrepancy in age, one of the things that happens is that we don't write about very much. With a young girl, I mean, I'm aware of it with my own girls. They see people over 35. My daughter, who is 17, went to a party that a young friend of mine had invited her to, and these were all 26 and 27-year-olds. And my daughter came home and she said, it was a nice party, Mommy, but everybody was so old, And so I think the difference in the age is dramatically expanded because of how she sees him. And when he looks at himself, I think he sees him as she sees him. It is not that anything so terrible is happening that's any different from the rest of us in middle age. But if you are being looked at by very young eyes, I think it's different. That's all.
Satisfied? Thank you. When you wrote your first story, which was the first story from the book you wrote?
From the collection?
Yeah.
The first story, actually, I think the first story I ever wrote was Love is Not a Pie. It's the opening story in the collection.
Yeah, yeah. Did you have troubles to get it published, or were they queuing up the publishers in front
Yeah,
of
they were
your
queuing up right outside my house in my small town. No, I had written the story, and one of the advantages of having a journalist for a father, who was actually a freelance writer, is that it never occurred to me that you write and don't send it out. It's like, you write to make a living. So,
Yeah.
by God, if I had gone to the trouble of finishing this story, I certainly hope somebody would publish it. So I sent it to the only magazines I knew about in America, which was sort of like the big glossy, you know, like the New Yorker and the Atlantic, and whatever other 3 or 4 magazines there were. And they sent it back with nice notes, which I didn't know then was a good thing. I just thought, well, who cares what they say? They're not publishing it. And so I went to the back of Best American Short Stories, which is this anthology, and in the back they print all of the magazines that they pick the stories from. And I looked for what I thought would be the most obscure fiction journal I could find. And it was great, because there was one that was only feminist fiction in Western Canada. And I thought, terrific, how many people are sending them stuff? So I sent them the story, and I got back this great note from the collective saying, Heidi and Gretchen and Mary and Colleen and Elizabeth all like the story very much, and we will send you $35 or the equivalent number of copies. And I was thrilled, and I thought, I better take the copies, you know. So, and I was very excited when it came, because it had real covers. And I thought it was going to look like the kind of thing you get from camp or from church, you know, like on the mimeograph machine. So that was great.
And this was actually the first story you wrote. You didn't have a secret cupboard full of stories.
No.
But after this turned out to be such a success, weren't you amazed? What did you think?
I thought it was pretty funny, actually. I thought it was very nice, you know. That's what I thought. I thought it was very nice and a little odd. But it was a good way to start, because it went into this little journal, and I didn't think very much about it, and I was working on another story. And by the time the first story got picked up for an anthology, I had finished the next story. So I thought, oh, I can do this. You know, I can write a few more stories, is what I thought.
I have to ask the question, are you such a tolerant, big-hearted, is that a word? A lady with a big heart?
Yeah, it makes me sound like a lassie. Yeah.
Yeah. That you seem to be when you write your books.
Well, you probably have to ask people who know me, but...
But are you a tolerant woman? Can you tolerate all the things you write about in your books, in real life?
It depends. I mean, I'm actually quite intolerant of people doing harm to children in real life. I'm actually quite intolerant of lots of kinds of things, but it is true that many of the things that other people find disturbing and intolerable don't bother me at all. On the other hand, you know, a lot of television bothers me, because it's just so junky, and you know, people being bad parents is something I'm fairly intolerant of, and people using really bad grammar, it bothers me quite a bit. But you know, so there's sort of a range of things that I can't stand, and I tend to be kind of crabby about it. But a lot of the things that other people find kind of shocking and unacceptable don't bother me so much.
But it's not television or bad grammar that I'm thinking of. It's this mariage à trois in Love is Not a Pie. And
I can't. The truth is, I cannot imagine for the life of me why anybody would care what consenting adults do.
No.
It's like I don't understand why it would bother them.
Of course, but there are children involved, and I don't condemn it, not at all. It's far from me, but you should think that these children who live with 3 parents, especially during the holidays, and how will they react later on in life? I mean, perhaps it's our upbringing that we always think there has to be a guilt feeling, a consciousness of guilt. How does it, what does it mean for the children, for their lives? You never write about this guilt. Perhaps it's my hang-up, but...
it's a funny thing. I don't think of the story as actually being as clear-cut or as sunny as you describe it, but I do think that it is a particular moment in the lives of these people, and it is how this young woman who's on the verge of her own marriage suddenly understands her childhood in a certain way. There's nothing that suggests to me that she might not 10 years later be very angry at her mother or at her father. There's nothing that suggests to me that her sister might not have understood it very differently, or that the wife of the mother's lover might not have had very different feelings about it. But in this moment, when she's looking at her own life, she understands it in a particular and positive way. I think this stuff is very complicated. But I think that marriage between two people is very complicated.
Yes,
and
I agree.
And I think living by yourself is not so easy either. So it seems to me that no matter what it is you do and no matter what it is you choose, it will never be very simple.
Kan ik nog iemand het woord geven? You had some questions. Ja.
What made you decide to start writing?
I don't think it was so much a conscious decision, actually. I was on my way to become a psychoanalyst, and I had gone for the consultation with the guy who I liked very much, who was going to be my analyst, and we had had a nice chat in which, as analysts do, he paid a gratifying amount of attention to what I had to say. And we were all set. I was going to start my training. And then on the way home, one of my children had very thoughtfully left a McDonald's box in the front seat, and I found myself making notes for a mystery on the box. And I thought, because I like reading mysteries, and so I got home and wrote up the notes, which actually came to about 10 pages for the mystery. And I thought, oh, well, what do you know? And no doubt if I had been in therapy at the time, somebody would have said to me, what do you think is going on, Amy? But fortunately, I wasn't. And so I didn't have to discuss it with anybody. So I called the analyst and said, I don't think so. I think I'm going to tell some stories. And he was actually quite an elderly man. He was great. He said, if I'm still alive and you change your mind, call me. And I haven't called him. So it was like that.
And where's this mystery?
Oh, it's in a desk drawer where it belongs.
And it will stay there?
Yeah. Yeah. I'd burn down the house first. Yeah.
Are you working on a new book, a new novel, a new short story?
Yeah, I'm slowly getting going with some short stories. They're starting to perk up a little bit. So I thought I'd do some stories, and then I thought I might give a novel another shot, and then like
At the same
that.
time?
No, yeah, right, because I'm so productive. No, I thought I'd try and finish like a whole, 12 stories. Because the problem is in America, if you only have 9 stories and they publish it, it looks like a magazine. I mean, it doesn't look like a whole book, so you need to have like 12 of them. So I thought I'd try to get a dozen stories, and then, then I'll be 50, and then I'll do a novel, and I thought,
Is it more difficult to write a novel than short stories?
Well, I've written more short stories.
Yeah.
So I feel like I know a little bit more about them. I like the room of a novel.
Yeah.
I like the fact that you can go really anywhere in the novel and pick up stuff way later and things like that. But I like, I like the fact that with a short story you kind of get in and you flip it around a couple of times and you're out of there before anybody catches you. So I like that a lot. So.
Kan ik nog iemand het woord geven? Then I thank you very, very much.
Oh, my pleasure.